Minnesota, 2008. A cold case long buried beneath snow and silence is finally solved. Lacey Marie Thornton was just 20, a college art student known for her gentle smile and the way she sketched life's quiet moments at the window of her part-time coffee shop job. Then one bitter March evening, she vanished. Her car was found idling near a wooded trailhead, keys still in the ignition. The investigation struggled. False leads, minimal evidence, and whispers of misconduct behind the scenes. For over a decade, her case haunted her small town. But now, a breakthrough in forensic science has triggered a stunning arrest no one saw coming. Before we begin, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. In the early months of 2008, the town of Stillwater, Minnesota, moved at a rhythm that seemed immune to chaos. Nestled along the St. Croix River, its cobblestone streets frozen in winter charm, echoed the quiet lives of its residents. This was the kind of town where everyone knew the name of the barista who made their morning coffee, and Lacey Marie Thornton was that barista. At just 20 years old, Lacy had already carved out a life defined by simplicity and grace. A sophomore at the local arts institute, she studied visual design with a focus on illustration. Her professors described her as focused and imaginative, often drawing during lectures, not out of distraction, but as a method of absorbing emotion. Art for Lacy wasn't a career, it was how she processed the world. She rented a small apartment above a bookstore just 2 blocks from campus, sharing the space with a fellow student. Her bedroom was filled with soft string lights, sketchbooks, and pinned-up drawings of local landscapes, pets she'd seen at the park, and one unfinished portrait of a woman staring out across a frozen lake. It was peaceful, minimal, and full of life. Most mornings, Lacy opened the cafe downtown by 6:30 a.m. She wore her dark brown curls in a loose bun, always tucked behind her ears. Customers noted her kind smile, the way she remembered orders, and the small hand-drawn doodles she'd sometimes add to their to-go cups. In a town like Stillwater, gestures like that didn't go unnoticed. She became a part of people's routines, the girl who made their lattes with quiet care. Outside of school and work, Lacy kept a modest circle of friends. She preferred small gatherings to parties, often choosing sketching by the river over loud social scenes. She volunteered once a month at a local animal rescue center, walking dogs and sketching portraits to help animals get adopted. Her roommate said she often returned home with stories about the animals and how she wished she could take them all in. Family was never far from her thoughts. Her parents, Don and Evelyn Thornton, lived about an hour away. Every Sunday evening without fail, Lacy called home. It was their tradition, a check-in over the phone about her classes, her latest drawings, her dreams. Her mom kept a scrapbook of Lacy's art and still had every birthday card her daughter had ever sent. She was always so intentional, Evelyn later recalled. Even the smallest things mattered to her. That semester, Lacy had been preparing a midterm project, a series of ink illustrations depicting spaces of quiet. Her sketchbook was filling up with images of winter woods, the inside of her favorite bookstore, a woman sitting alone in a chapel pew. It was deeply introspective, and she was proud of it. She told her art professor she wanted to one day illustrate children's books, something simple, hopeful. But hope was a fragile thing. In hindsight, there were no warning signs. No threats, no strange encounters, no fear in her voice during her weekly call with her parents. Just the usual. She'd finished a shift at the cafe, picked up a new pen set at the art store, and planned to spend Sundays sketching at her favorite spot by the lake. To those around her, Lacey Marie Thornton was simply living her life, gently, deliberately, with grace. But behind the stillness of small-town routine, something else was moving. Something uninvited, something watching. What was the first sign that something had gone terribly wrong? March 16, 2008, was the kind of day Minnesotans knew too well, caught between the tail end of winter and the hesitant stirrings of spring. A stiff wind cut through the trees, but the sun lingered just long enough to hint at warmth. For Lacey Marie Thornton, it was a typical Sunday. Her morning started with the steady rhythm of espresso machines and friendly chatter at the cafe where she worked. She wore her usual gray knit beanie and layered cardigan, practical, cozy. Nothing seemed out of place. Her shift ended at 4 p.m. A co-worker later recalled that Lacy appeared relaxed, even cheerful. She'd mentioned plans to head out to Stillwater Lake to work on her Quiet Spaces sketch series. her favorite way to wind down. The lake was less than a 10-minute drive, bordered by quiet trails and partially frozen in mid-March. She often sat on a particular bench tucked beneath a cluster of pine trees facing the water. It was a place she returned to again and again. That would be the last time anyone saw her. By 7 p.m., her roommate Kayla assumed Lacy had stayed late to sketch. But by 9 p.m., concern began to creep in. Lacy was never one to miss check-ins, especially on a Sunday, her family's call night. Kayla texted her. No response. She called twice. Straight to voicemail. By midnight, she was pacing the apartment, trying to talk herself out of panic. Maybe Lacy's phone died. Maybe she got caught up in drawing. But the unease was real. Something was wrong. At 6:30 the next morning, Kayla contacted the Stillwater Police Department to file a missing person report. Officers were dispatched shortly after, though they noted it had only been a few hours since the last known contact. A patrol officer drove by the lakeside trail Lacy was known to frequent. There, just off the gravel parking lot, they found her car. It was running. The driver's door was open, keys still in the ignition. Her jacket was in the back seat, a thermos of tea still warm in the cup holder. But what sent chills down the officer's spine was the sketchbook, placed neatly on the passenger seat, as if it had been intentionally left behind. A fresh page had been started, the early outline of a tree by the lake. The pencil was tucked in the spine, unmoved. There were no footprints visible near the vehicle due to light snowfall overnight. No signs of forced entry, no obvious struggle. Just the eerie stillness of an abandoned car and a growing sense that time was running out. By noon, search teams had mobilized. K-9 units, volunteers, and officers swept the wooded area near the lake. Helicopters circled overhead while divers checked the waterline. News of Lacy's disappearance spread quickly. Flyers were posted across town. Friends gathered in clusters, clutching warm drinks, whispering theories. Lacy wasn't the type to run off. She wasn't reckless. This wasn't like her. Police questioned those who had seen her last, starting with her co-workers. One recalled seeing a red pickup parked 2 spots over from Lacy's that afternoon, unfamiliar with tinted windows. Another remembered a man who came in asking about the girl with the sketchbook a few days earlier, but couldn't give a name. It wasn't much, but it was something. As the sun set on March 17th, the town of Stillwater began to realize this was no simple case of miscommunication. A young woman had vanished in broad daylight, leaving behind nothing but a parked car and an unfinished drawing. Did anyone see what happened to Lacy in those critical evening hours? 3 days after Lacey Marie Thornton vanished, hope was beginning to wear thin in Stillwater. The missing posters taped to storefronts and bulletin boards flapped in the wind, their ink smudged by frost and light snow. Her parents had joined the search effort, holding on to a fragile thread of belief that maybe, just maybe, she had wandered off and would be found alive. But by the 3rd day, even that hope had started to fade. On March 19, 2008, shortly after 10 a.m., a volunteer searcher veered off the main trail near Willow Creek, about half a mile from where Lacy's car had been found. The wooded area was thick with underbrush, the ground damp from melted snow. And there, behind a tangle of dead branches, he saw something that didn't belong, the outline of a body, pale against the dark soil. It was Lacy. She was lying on her side, partially hidden beneath leaves and bramble, as if someone had tried to obscure her but hadn't taken the time to bury her fully. Her jacket was torn, bunched around her waist, and her shoes were gone. There were bruises along her arms, neck, and jawline, defensive wounds the medical examiner would later confirm. A small laceration above her eyebrow suggested a struggle. Most telling of all was the cause of death: manual strangulation. It was personal, intentional, prolonged. News of the discovery spread rapidly, and with it came a deep, unsettling silence across the community. Candlelight vigils were held within hours. A town that once prided itself on safety and trust was suddenly filled with unease. Parents walked their children home from school. Doors were locked earlier. People glanced over their shoulders. Police cordoned off the area and began collecting what little evidence they could. Crime scene technicians combed through the underbrush, carefully gathering fibers, soil samples, and any trace of foreign material. But the scene was frustratingly clean. There were no clear footprints, no discarded weapon, and no signs of sexual assault. Her phone was not recovered, and her sketchbook, Last seen in her car offered no additional insight. No fingerprints, no DNA, nothing to point to a suspect. It was as if someone had known exactly how to leave no trace. The medical examiner's report confirmed what many feared. Lacy had died within hours of her disappearance. She hadn't run away. She hadn't gotten lost. She had been taken and murdered just outside of town, in a space where hikers and students regularly passed. And no one had seen a thing. Detectives began to piece together her final known movements, but there was a troubling gap between the moment she left work and the time her car was found. Security cameras near the lake trail offered limited visibility, and no footage captured her walking into the woods. Police were left to speculate. Had someone lured her off the trail? Had she known her attacker? Or had someone been watching her, waiting for the right moment? Theories began to swirl. Some whispered that the crime scene was too clean, too meticulous. Could this have been the work of someone experienced? Someone who had done this before? Or was it simply a matter of luck? The killer vanishing into the landscape before any trace could be found. The case that had begun as a missing person investigation had now escalated into a full-scale homicide inquiry. But with so little to go on, authorities were already facing a daunting uphill battle. Could the lack of forensic evidence mean this was a planned, professional crime? With the discovery of Lacey Marie Thornton's body, the case took on a grim urgency. What began as a missing person investigation had now escalated into a homicide with almost no usable evidence. Stillwater police launched a full-scale inquiry, flooding the area with officers, crime scene analysts, and detectives. But from the start, it felt like they were chasing shadows. Detectives began by circling the people closest to Lacy. Her roommate, Kayla, was interviewed multiple times. She described Lacy's routines, her sketching habits, her Sunday evening calls with family. Nothing pointed to a secret life. Her parents, still in shock, confirmed the same. Lacy had no history of running away, no conflicts, no known threats. If anything, she had lived a life so quiet, so predictably structured that her disappearance was all the more jarring. Then came the extended circle: friends, classmates, ex-boyfriends. One former boyfriend had moved out of state but was quickly located and cleared through alibi and phone records. A barista at the cafe remembered a man in his late 30s who had been lingering around the shop days before the disappearance, asking odd questions. His description was vague, his name unknown. One lead seemed promising. A local hiker reported seeing a red pickup truck parked near the trailhead around dusk the day Lacy disappeared. The same make and model was seen again the next day, but the license plate had been obscured by mud. Police canvassed the region looking for similar vehicles, but nothing conclusive came of it. The man associated with the truck was never identified. Stillwater's small-town tranquility began to erode. Whispers spread quickly, not just about Lacy's murder, but about the police's handling of the case. Some believed the early hours of the disappearance had been mishandled, that police didn't treat the missing person report with the seriousness it deserved, that the car, found still running, should have triggered an immediate escalation. At the heart of the storm was the Stillwater Police Department, already facing budget cuts and staff shortages. Anonymous sources claimed some corners had been cut, that the search perimeter had been too narrow, that crime scene procedures hadn't been strictly followed. Whether these claims were accurate or fueled by fear and grief, they cast a shadow over the investigation. Without a suspect, motive, or forensic breakthrough, detectives were left to rely on human memory, notoriously unreliable after just a few days, let alone weeks. Composite sketches were drawn based on vague sightings. Tips came in, but most were dead ends. Some theorized Lacy had been targeted by a stranger. Others believed it had to be someone she knew. Someone who knew her routines, where she liked to draw, when she'd be alone. As weeks turned into months, the case stalled. The posters began to fade. The community moved into a strange limbo, mourning a loss they didn't understand, fearing an unknown threat, unsure where to place their trust. Detectives continued their efforts, but momentum was slipping. They lacked surveillance footage, cell tower pings, or DNA. What they had was a timeline with too many gaps, a victim with no enemies, and a crime scene that felt almost deliberately clean. Behind the scenes, tensions grew. Families demanded accountability. Journalists began asking uncomfortable questions about the initial response. And inside the precinct, some officers began to fear what others already suspected, that they were running out of options. Could crucial early mistakes have doomed the investigation? The spring thaw came and went, but the chill surrounding Lacey Marie Thornton's case never lifted. As the years rolled by, the snow returned each winter to cover the trail where her car was found, the creek where her body had been discovered, and the town's unanswered questions. Still water tried to heal. The cafe where Lacy had worked hired new staff. Her college displayed a modest memorial plaque in the art building hallway. But for Don and Evelyn Thornton, time did not bring closure. Every empty holiday chair, every unanswered Sunday call, every birthday that passed, each was a wound that never stopped bleeding. In the first year after her death, the Thorntons organized monthly community walks. They lit candles along the lakeside trail and placed sunflowers, Lacy's favorite, on the bench where she used to sit and sketch. That bench slowly transformed into a living memorial. Friends pinned drawings, old notes, and even art supplies to its backrest. Students left behind heartfelt letters and torn pages from sketchbooks. Some days it was covered in snow. Other days it overflowed with memories. Don Thornton retired early from his job in logistics. Evelyn, a former elementary school teacher, devoted herself entirely to pushing the case forward. She kept detailed notes, made calls weekly to the department, and created a timeline board in their basement. She mailed letters to state lawmakers, wrote emails to journalists, and launched a website dedicated to Lacy's memory and the demand for justice. For a while, local media continued to cover the story, especially on anniversaries. But as the years dragged on, the headlines faded. By 2012, nearly 4 years after the murder, the Stillwater Police Department quietly shelved the case. It wasn't an official closure, just a quiet acknowledgement that there were no more leads, no more resources. The detective originally assigned to Lacy's case retired that summer. The evidence box labeled Thornton LM Homicide was stored in a climate-controlled vault in the county records division. Dust gathered. The case grew colder, but Evelyn refused to let her daughter disappear a second time. She began attending victims' advocacy conferences, joining groups for families of the missing and murdered. She gave interviews on small-town radio stations and appeared in a regional documentary about unsolved Minnesota homicides. In each, she repeated the same quiet plea, "My daughter's killer is still out there, and we're not going away." Even as years passed and new crimes captured public attention, Evelyn kept pressure on officials. She contacted forensic experts and asked them about new testing methods. She inquired about grants for cold case reviews. She even reached out to the FBI, asking if the case could be reviewed under their VICAP program. Each attempt seemed to lead nowhere, but she pressed on. In 2015, Dawn was diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's disease. Even then, they continued their advocacy. "We made a promise to her," Evelyn told a local reporter. "We said we'd never stop, and they didn't." What most people didn't know was that Evelyn had begun compiling a list of all other unsolved homicides in the region dating back to 1995. She studied them at night, looking for patterns, similarities, anything that might spark a connection. Her obsession was fueled not just by grief but by a mother's unbreakable instinct. Someone knew something, and one day someone would talk. Because time doesn't bury secrets, it just hides them. And grief, when paired with persistence, has a way of shaking loose even the dustiest corners of justice. What would finally pull this case from the shadows? In early 2022, a quiet shift began inside the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. Under mounting pressure from victim advocacy groups and with renewed state funding, the agency launched a long-overdue initiative, clearing the backlog of cold case evidence using next-generation forensic tools. Among the dozens of cases selected for reevaluation was the 2008 homicide of Lacey Marie Thornton. Forensic science had advanced dramatically in the years since her murder. One of the most promising innovations was genetic genealogy, a method that went beyond traditional DNA comparison. Instead of needing a direct match in a criminal database, this process could identify distant relatives through public DNA databases and build family trees that pointed investigators toward potential suspects. Detectives retrieved evidence from storage, painstakingly preserved swabs from Lacy's hands and fingernails, trace materials collected from her torn jacket, and a single, degraded biological sample lifted from beneath her fingernail. In 2008, that sample had been too degraded to use. In 2022, it was just enough. The sample was sent to a private lab specializing in low copy number DNA analysis. Within weeks, a genetic profile was extracted and uploaded into a genealogical database. Then, the waiting began. By midsummer, the lab contacted investigators with a promising update. They had found partial matches, 2 individuals from different branches of the same family. Third cousins, one living in Ohio, the other in rural Wisconsin. Through careful cross-referencing of public records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, and obituaries, forensic genealogists built out the extended family tree. It spanned multiple states and generations. Eventually, the tree narrowed to a single branch, one that included a man named James Allen Jeffers, age 41, living in a small town about 30 miles from Stillwater. Jeffers had a minor record, a trespassing charge in 2014, a DUI in 2017, but nothing violent. He had never appeared on any suspect list during the original investigation. He hadn't lived in Stillwater, but records showed he had worked briefly for a landscaping company contracted to clear trails in the region during the spring of 2008. Intrigued, investigators discreetly surveilled Jeffers. They watched his routines, noted his contacts. In September 2022, they collected a discarded item, a fast food cup from a public trash bin near his residence. The straw was swabbed and sent to the lab. The result was definitive. The DNA profile from the cup matched the degraded DNA found beneath Lacey Thornton's fingernail in 2008. The odds of a false match were less than 1 in a billion. Investigators had what they believed was a breakthrough, but it raised an immediate haunting question. Was James Jeffers the man who murdered Lacey Marie Thornton? Or was he simply related to someone who had? Detectives couldn't afford assumptions. A genealogical match confirmed shared DNA, but it didn't prove motive, opportunity, or action. Had Jeffers and Lacy ever crossed paths? Did he have any connection to the cafe, the trail, or her college? Police pulled his old employment records. One entry stood out. A subcontractor permit from March 2008 listed his assignment near Stillwater Lake, the exact area where Lacy's car was found. They also discovered he had briefly visited a nearby hardware store on March 16, 2008, just hours before Lacy vanished. Surveillance footage from that day no longer existed, but the receipt placed him less than 10 miles from the crime scene. Investigators began preparing an arrest warrant, but they knew public scrutiny would be intense. This arrest couldn't just be about DNA. It had to be built carefully, thoroughly for Lacy, for her family, for the truth. Was he truly the killer, or just connected by blood? On the crisp morning of October 18, 2022, officers from the Washington County Sheriff's Department approached a modest, single-story home on the outskirts of Pine Grove, Minnesota. The property was quiet, tucked behind a line of aging pine trees, its siding faded, its mailbox leaning. Inside, 41-year-old Mark Jeffers sat at his kitchen table, eating a bowl of cereal and watching the morning news, unaware that the case he thought was long dead had come roaring back to life. The arrest was swift. Officers knocked, entered with a warrant, and placed Jeffers in handcuffs without resistance. He was calm, almost detached. When asked if he understood the charges, the 2008 murder of Lacey Marie Thornton, he blinked once, then nodded. Within hours, the news spread like wildfire. 2008, cold case solved. DNA leads to arrest in Lacey Thornton homicide. Jeffers was a familiar name to some in Stillwater. Though he hadn't lived there, he had taken on odd jobs in the area: trail clearing, seasonal landscaping, snow removal. He was the type of man who blended in easily, polite, quiet, forgettable. Over the years, he'd been hired by local homeowners, including one family just blocks from the trail where Lacy disappeared. No one had ever suspected him, but what investigators found inside Jeffers' home shattered any illusion of innocence. In a storage room off the garage, police uncovered a plastic container labeled 2008. Inside were local newspaper clippings about Lacy's disappearance and death, some with handwritten notes in the margins. There were crude hand-drawn maps of the Stillwater Trail system, including a circled area near Willow Creek. Tucked inside an envelope was a faded photograph of the lakeside bench where Lacy often sketched. The most chilling discovery, however, was a notebook filled with fragmented journal entries, some referencing the girl with the sketchbook, and vague mentions of guilt, timing, and no one saw. Prosecutors called the evidence a psychological footprint, the remnants of a mind trying to hide, but unable to forget. Jeffers maintained his innocence. During his first police interview, he claimed he didn't know Lacy, had never met her, and couldn't explain how his DNA ended up under her fingernails. "It's not possible," he said, repeating the phrase again and again. But the forensic case was ironclad. The match between Jeffers' discarded DNA and the biological material found on Lacy had a statistical probability of error lower than 1 in a billion. Investigators also uncovered cell tower records placing Jeffers' phone within 2 miles of the crime scene at the estimated time of death, data they hadn't had access to in 2008 when news of the arrest reached Stillwater. Reactions ranged from disbelief to anger to betrayal. Some residents remembered hiring Jeffers to mow lawns or fix gutters. Others realized they had shared grocery store aisles or waited behind him in line at the post office. To think the man responsible had walked among them for over a decade sent a shiver through the town. Lacy's parents, Don and Evelyn, were informed privately before the arrest was made public. Their reaction was a mixture of relief and heartbreak. "We never gave up," Evelyn told reporters through tears. "We always believed the truth would find its way out." As the case moved toward trial, attention turned to the legal challenge ahead. The prosecution had powerful DNA evidence, but no eyewitnesses, no murder weapon, no direct confession. The case would test how much weight a 14-year-old forensic breakthrough could carry in a courtroom. How would the justice system handle a case built on DNA after 14 years? The trial of Mark Jeffers opened on January 9, 2024, inside a packed courtroom in Washington County. It had been nearly 16 years since the murder of Lacey Marie Thornton, and the echoes of grief had never truly quieted. Now at last, justice was being put to the test. Lacy's family arrived early each day, sitting in the front row, just feet from the man accused of ending their daughter's life. Evelyn Thornton held her daughter's final sketchbook in her lap, a quiet symbol of the voice that had been silenced in 2008. Don, slowed by his Parkinson's, sat beside her with a steady gaze fixed on the proceedings. The trial wasn't just a legal battle. It was a reckoning. The prosecution opened with what they called the hidden story of a predator who wore a mask of invisibility. They walked the jury through a timeline, reconstructed through years of technological advancements. Jeffers' work history placing him at Stillwater Trails in March 2008. His cell phone pinging within range of the trail system. The discarded DNA sample that matched the trace evidence recovered from Lacy's fingernails. Expert witnesses took the stand. Forensic analysts testified about how DNA degrades over time, but how modern techniques made the once unusable sample viable. A genealogist detailed the family tree that narrowed the suspect pool. A digital forensics expert explained how, even after so many years, data could reconstruct Jeffers' location with high probability. Then came the physical evidence. The maps, the clippings, the handwritten journal entries found in Jeffers' home. A chilling passage was read aloud. Some art is too dangerous to watch unfold. Prosecutors argued it was a veiled reference to Lacy, the girl who had spent her last day sketching in silence. The defense countered with skepticism. They argued the DNA sample could have been contaminated, touched by someone else, transferred through an unknown surface. They claimed the prosecution was relying on circumstantial evidence and speculative interpretation. Most notably, they pressed the question of motive. Why would Jeffers, a man with no history of violent crime, suddenly commit such a brutal act? But the jury didn't see coincidence. They saw patterns. Witnesses were called who remembered Jeffers from 2008. A retired cafe employee recognized him as someone who lingered too long near the shop, often watching Lacy as she wiped down tables or stepped outside for breaks. Another remembered seeing a red truck, the same make, Jeffers once owned, parked near the lake trail the day of her disappearance. The prosecution's closing statement was resolute. Mark Jeffers counted on being forgettable, but the evidence remembered what we didn't. Deliberation took less than 5 hours. On the fifth day of the trial, the jury returned with a unanimous verdict. Guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, unlawful confinement, and tampering with evidence. As the verdict was read aloud, Evelyn clutched Lacy's sketchbook to her chest, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Dawn placed a hand over hers. It was not a moment of celebration, but of solemn relief. Justice, long dormant, had finally stirred. Jeffers showed little emotion as the sentence was delivered: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered. Evelyn spoke briefly. "This won't bring our daughter back, but it tells the world she mattered. That her life, her art, her spirit, they weren't forgotten." And yet, as the gavel fell and the courtroom emptied, a new question lingered in the air. Beyond the verdict, what legacy would Lacy's case leave behind? In the months following the trial, Stillwater began to breathe again. For 16 years, the town had lived with the quiet weight of an unsolved murder, a lingering shadow that touched every corner of the community. Now, with justice delivered, healing could finally begin. But healing didn't mean forgetting. Lacey Marie Thornton's legacy quickly transformed from tragedy to purpose. Her parents, Dawn and Evelyn, took the civil settlement they received after filing a wrongful death claim against the county, alleging early mishandling of the case, and used it to establish the Lacy Light Foundation. Its mission was clear: to fund DNA testing and genealogical analysis for cold cases in rural and underfunded police departments across Minnesota. The foundation partnered with labs, specializing in low copy number DNA and assisted departments with accessing public genealogy databases. Within its first year, it helped solve 3 additional cold cases. Victims whose names had long been lost in the backlog, now given a second chance at justice through the same science that cracked Lacy's case. Back in Stillwater, remembrance bloomed in color. Local artists, many of whom had attended the Arts Institute with Lacy, came together to paint a mural on the brick wall of the cafe where she once worked. It featured Lacy surrounded by open sketchbooks, sunflowers, and the lake she loved. The mural's title, written in flowing script, read, "She saw quiet beauty everywhere." Lacy's former art professor organized a traveling exhibition using pages from her original sketchbooks. Displayed in soft-lit galleries, her drawings of benches, trees, quiet faces, and solitude spoke of a young woman with a deep connection to the world around her, a voice expressed through pencil, not volume. The exhibit, titled Echoes of Lacy, toured colleges throughout the Midwest and was later added to the permanent collection at the Minnesota Center for Book Arts. The statewide impact of her case didn't end there. Inspired by growing attention to Lacy's story, Minnesota passed legislation in 2025 requiring standardized preservation protocols for forensic evidence in violent crime cases, regardless of solvability. The bill, known informally as Lacy's Law, mandated that physical evidence be stored indefinitely and that families be notified before a case is decommissioned or shelved. For Evelyn Thornton, it wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about using her daughter's story to keep other victims from slipping into silence. She was more than a case file, Evelyn said during a press conference announcing the foundation's launch. Lacy had dreams, talents, and a heart that saw beauty where most didn't. We couldn't save her. But maybe, through this work, we can save someone else. Each year on the anniversary of her death, the community gathers by the lake. Candles are lit, sketches are shared. Lacy's bench, now adorned with a bronze plaque and fresh flowers year-round, remains a place of quiet reflection. Stillwater, once paralyzed by fear, now carries the memory of Lacy not as a ghost, but as a light. Yet, for every case solved, Evelyn knows there are still so many waiting. Families still trapped in the uncertainty she lived through for nearly 14 years. Victims who have no mural, no foundation, no answers. That's why the Lacy Light Foundation continues to grow, funded by donations, state grants, and volunteers. Not just to remember one life, but to honor many, because cold cases don't just fade, they echo. Justice was served, but how many others still wait in the cold? The solving of the 2008 Minnesota cold case involving 20-year-old art student Lacey Marie Thornton stands as a testament to what time, tenacity, and technology can achieve when aligned with purpose. Once a name on a fading missing poster, Lacy is now remembered as a symbol of quiet resilience and the power of persistent love. Her life, soft-spoken and full of promise, was stolen in an act of violence that haunted a town and paralyzed a family. But her voice, captured in lines of graphite in journals, in memories, was never truly lost. It took 14 long years, a scientific breakthrough, and a mother who refused to stop knocking on doors, but the silence finally cracked. Through modern DNA technology, including forensic genealogy, Lacy's killer was identified and brought to justice. But beyond the arrest and conviction of Mark Jeffers, something deeper emerged: reform, remembrance, and a renewed urgency to help those still waiting. Today, Lacy's legacy lives on not only in art and memory, but in legislation and action. The foundation her parents created funds new DNA investigations, inspires policy change, and supports other families walking the same long, uncertain road they once traveled. Through her story, cold case evidence protocols have improved, and voices once overlooked are being heard again. The Thornton family's journey reminds us that closure is not the end. It is a beginning. A beginning for advocacy, for reform, and for the healing that only truth can provide. Their daughter was more than a victim. She became a light in the darkness, not just for them, but for an entire state still reckoning with the cases that remain unsolved. For every Lacy, there are countless others still waiting, buried beneath red tape, time, or neglect. And so we remember her not just to grieve, but to act. Justice, though it may sleep, never forgets. Let her name be a promise. Let her story be a call to never stop searching. If Lacy's light touched you, share her story. Help others remember, because justice delayed is still justice served.